The sun had just begun to rise over the sprawling plains of New Mexico, its golden rays spilling across the dry grass and catching the dew that clung to the fence posts. Cattle bawled in the distance, their cries echoing against the wooden beams of the ranch as dust swirled lazily in the morning light. The ranch was alive with noise and movement, men preparing saddles, loading rifles, shouting instructions to one another as the day's work began. Among them was Ethan Calloway, a young ranch hand of 23 whose quiet nature often made him blend into the background. Ethan wasn't the strongest or the loudest man on the ranch, but he carried a kind of patience the others lacked. Where most saw animals as profit or tools, he saw creatures with spirits of their own. That morning, as he checked the outer pastures, something unusual caught his eye near the edge of the brush. A faint whimper drifted on the wind, low and pained, barely audible over the stamping of cattle. Ethan stopped, ears straining. He followed the sound, moving carefully through the brittle grass until he found the source, a dog half hidden beneath a clump of mesquite bushes. Its fur was matted with blood, and one hind leg hung twisted at an unnatural angle. The animal's ribs were sharp against its skin, its breathing shallow, but even in its weakened state, its eyes held fire, wild, proud, unyielding. Ethan crouched, his hand hovering in the air. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice softer than the rustle of the wind. "I won't hurt you." The dog growled, baring its teeth, but the effort was weak. Around its neck hung a strip of leather, decorated with beads and faint etchings. Ethan recognized the markings, Apache. This wasn't just a stray. This animal belonged to someone, perhaps even carried meaning beyond what his people understood. He glanced back toward the ranch buildings. The foreman, Briggs, would have ordered the dog shot on sight. To them, anything tied to the Apache was an enemy, no matter how small or wounded. Ethan felt the weight of the decision pressing against his chest. He could turn away, pretend he never saw the animal, or he could do something reckless. The dog let out another whimper, and the sound cut through his hesitation like a knife. Slowly, Ethan shrugged off his coat and laid it gently over the animal. The dog didn't fight, only watched him with wary, dark eyes. Ethan carefully scooped it into his arms, feeling the tremor of its body against his own, carrying the animal. Back to the bunkhouse was impossible. Too many eyes, too many questions. Instead, he ducked into the abandoned tool shed near the far fence line, a place no one bothered with anymore. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rusted metal, but it was quiet, private. He set the dog down on a pile of old burlap sacks and examined its wounds. The leg was broken clean, the bone misaligned. The cuts on its flank looked like they came from barbed wire, or perhaps a struggle with another animal. Ethan tore strips from his undershirt, cleaned the blood as best he could, and fashioned a crude splint from 2 broken fence slats. The dog endured his touch with surprising calm, only flinching when the bone was set in place. "There you go," Ethan murmured, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You're tougher than most men I know." He slipped outside and returned with a tin of water, holding it under the dog's muzzle. At first, the animal resisted, but then its tongue flicked out, lapping greedily at the cool liquid. Watching it drink. Ethan felt something stir inside him, something that had nothing to do with duty or survival. This wasn't about cattle, wages, or the endless fight between settlers and Apache. This was about life, about mercy. And in that moment, Ethan made a choice he knew would not sit well with the ranch. When the dog finished drinking, it lowered its head onto the burlap, eyes half closed but no longer full of pain. Ethan sat beside it, his back against the shed wall, staring at the thin crack of light slipping through the wooden boards. He wondered who the animal belonged to, what story lay behind those beaded markings. He also wondered what Briggs would say if he found out. But Ethan didn't care. Not yet. For now, all that mattered was that the dog was alive, and he had been the one to give it another chance. He didn't know it then, but this single act of compassion would ripple outward, carrying consequences far greater than he could imagine. The ranch hand's heart had chosen mercy over obedience, and in the unforgiving world of the frontier, that choice was bound to cost him everything. The days that followed Ethan's secret act of mercy were filled with tension. By day, he worked the ranch as though nothing had changed, mending fences, driving cattle, and saddling horses under the hot New Mexico sun. By night, he slipped away quietly to the tool shed where the wounded Apache dog lay recovering. Each visit became a ritual. Ethan would check the splint, change the bandages he had fashioned from rags, and bring scraps of meat swiped from the cookhouse. Slowly, the dog regained strength. Its ribs no longer jutted so sharply, and the fierce light in its eyes grew brighter. At first, it tolerated Ethan with suspicion, but after a few nights, it began to lift its head whenever he entered, even thumping its tail against the burlap in faint acknowledgement. Ethan named him Ghost, not because the dog was white. He was dark-coated with patches of gray, but because Ethan felt like the animal carried the presence of someone unseen. There was weight in those eyes, a history Ethan couldn't explain. But secrets on a ranch don't last long. It was the third evening since he'd found Ghost. Ethan slipped from the cookhouse after supper with a chunk of cornbread wrapped in cloth. The moon hung low, silvering the dusty landscape, and crickets filled the silence. He pushed open the tool shed door carefully, crouched down, and placed the food before Ghost. "You'll be walking soon enough," Ethan whispered. Strong as ever, the dog wagged its tail and tore into the bread. Ethan smiled, his rough hands resting on his knees. He didn't notice the shadow moving outside the shed. The door creaked sharply, flung wide open. Lantern light spilled in, and there stood Briggs, the foreman. His thick frame filled the doorway, and his face twisted with disgust. Behind him, two ranch hands peered in with narrowed eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," Briggs spat. "I thought I smelled something rotten around here." Ethan froze, caught between the dog and the glare of his superior. Ghost growled low, ears flattened, though his body was still too weak to stand. Briggs stepped forward, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He jabbed a finger toward the dog. "You've been hiding this? An Apache cur? You bringing their filth into my ranch?" "It's just a dog," Ethan said evenly, rising to his feet. "He was hurt. I couldn't just leave him to die." Briggs barked a laugh, sharp and cruel. "Just a dog? Boy, you don't have the sense God gave a mule. You know what this means? That beast is marked, belongs to the Apache. You're harboring it like some kind of sympathizer." The words stung more than Ethan expected. He opened his mouth, but Briggs didn't give him the chance. He turned to the other hands. "You hear this? The boy's feeding an Apache's dog. Might as well be feeding the warriors themselves." The ranch hands murmured uneasily, shifting their weight. They weren't cruel men, but fear of the Apache ran deep in their bones. One of them glanced at Ethan with pity, another with suspicion. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Mercy ain't treason," he said firmly. "It's just decency. Something you wouldn't understand." That was the wrong thing to say. Briggs's face darkened, and he grabbed Ethan by the collar, yanking him forward. "You don't get to preach to me, boy. Not when you're endangering every man on this ranch." The foreman shoved him back hard. Ethan stumbled but kept his footing. His fists clenched, but he knew swinging at Briggs would only dig the hole deeper. Briggs pointed toward the bunkhouse. "Pack your things. You're done here. Ain't no room on this ranch for traitors or fools. By sunrise, I don't want to see your face again." The words echoed like a gunshot. Dismissal wasn't just the loss of wages, it was a stain, a mark that would follow Ethan wherever he went. A ranch hand cast out under suspicion of siding with the Apache might never find honest work again. Ethan swallowed hard, anger rising in his chest. But then he looked at Ghost, still lying weak on the burlap, watching the scene with quiet intensity. Ethan knew his choice had already been made the moment he carried the dog into the shed. "Fine," Ethan said, his voice steady. "If it means I lose this place for saving one life, then so be it." "I'd do it again," Briggs sneered. "Get out before I decide to drag you out." He kicked at the burlap, making Ghost yelp, then stormed off with the others. Ethan knelt by the dog, running, a calming hand over its head. "Don't worry, Ghost. We'll find our own way." That night, under the cover of darkness, Ethan gathered his few belongings, a bedroll, a knife, a canteen, and the clothes on his back. He slung his sack over his shoulder and returned to the shed. Ghost hobbled to his feet, unsteady but willing. Together they slipped into the night, leaving the ranch lights behind them. As they walked, Ethan felt a strange mixture of loss and freedom. He had been cast out, humiliated before his peers, his future uncertain. But Ghost limped faithfully beside him, and somehow that made the weight easier to bear. Neither of them knew that by dawn, whispers of Ethan's dismissal would begin to spread, beyond the ranch, beyond the settlers, and into the ears of those who would soon ride with Fire and Thunder. The ranch looked different without Ethan in it. The bunkhouse felt quieter, though none of the men would admit it. By sunrise, Ethan's bedroll was gone, his few possessions cleared out, and the only reminder of him was the whisper of boots that would never again cross the dirt yard. Some ranch hands shook their heads in silence, thinking the foreman had been too harsh. Others muttered that maybe Briggs was right, that showing softness toward Apache things, even a dog, was dangerous. Mid-morning, the story had already twisted. One hand swore he saw Ethan kneeling to the dog, whispering like it was some kind of spirit. Another claimed Ethan had been feeding it scraps from the ranch table, almost like he was trading with the Apache. By the time the tale reached the saloon, in town it had grown bigger still. Ethan Calloway had been caught harboring an Apache scout in the form of a dog. The town folk loved a good story, especially one that fed their fears. Men hunched over whiskey glasses spoke in low voices about betrayal. Women passing by with baskets of laundry clutched them tighter, shaking their heads. "Didn't surprise me none," one said. "That boy always seemed soft." But outside, the circle of settlers and ranchers, another set of ears caught the rumor. Apache scouts had been watching the ranch for weeks, keeping track of cattle drives, riders, and the numbers of men. They melted in and out of the landscape like shadows, unseen but always present. One scout, a lean man with sharp eyes named Taza, lingered in the mesquite scrub on the edge of town when he overheard two ranch hands arguing. "I tell you, Briggs was right to throw him out," one said. "Helping the Apache's dog? Hell, it's the same as siding with them." The other shrugged, uncertain. "Maybe, but I seen the boy. He weren't doing no harm, just mending a broke leg. Ain't nothing wrong with that." "Wrong enough to cost us all our lives if the Apache think we're weak." Taza's lips curled in the faintest smile. The words told him much, but the truth mattered more than gossip. That night, as stars shimmered cold above the desert, he tracked Ethan's trail away from the ranch. Meanwhile, Ethan and Ghost trudged across the open country. The nights were bitterly cold, the days long and punishing. Ethan carried what little food he had, sharing it with the dog even when his own stomach gnawed with hunger. Ghost, though limping, grew stronger every day. They camped beneath a stand of cottonwoods one evening, the sound of the river trickling nearby. Ethan leaned against a log, staring at the flames of his small fire, his thoughts dark. The humiliation of being thrown out of the ranch still burned, but deeper than that was the sting of betrayal. He had given years of hard work to Briggs, done every task asked of him without complaint, and in the end, one act of mercy had branded him a traitor. He looked at Ghost, curled against the firelight, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "You're worth it," Ethan said quietly. "I don't know why, but you are." Unseen in the shadows beyond the firelight, Taza crouched and watched. He saw how Ethan tended the dog's splint with care, how he gave the animal the last bite of his cornbread. There was no deceit in the boy's actions, only a strange kind of honor. By the time Taza returned to his people, the story had changed again, but this time in truth. He stood before the Apache council fire and spoke. The white man did not harm what was ours. He saved it, fed it, carried it when it could not walk. His people cast him out for this, shaming him for mercy. Yet he did not abandon the dog. The Ma elders listened in silence, their eyes flickering with firelight. Among the Apache, dogs were not just animals. They were guardians, companions of warriors, spirits of loyalty. To see one saved, even by an outsider, was no small thing. An old warrior nodded slowly. A man who shows kindness to what is sacred shows respect to us all. The decision began to take shape, though no words had yet been spoken. The ranch that had cast out such a man had shown its heart to be cruel, unworthy of honor. The boy, Ethan, had shown the opposite. Back among the settlers, the rumor mill churned faster. Some said Ethan had been taken by the Apache already. Others said he was wandering mad on the plains. Briggs, proud of his choice, fueled the talk with his own embellishments, claiming Ethan had nearly brought ruin upon them all. But while settlers gossiped over whiskey and fear, in the Apache camp a different plan was being laid, one that would not be carried by whispers, but by the thunder of hooves. And somewhere on the plains, Ethan sat by his fire, unaware that his simple choice, to save one wounded creature, was becoming the center of a storm that would soon sweep across the land. The plains stretched wide and unforgiving, a sea of tall grass that swayed in the wind like waves on a restless ocean. Ethan walked through it with Ghost limping faithfully at his side, the sound of his boots crunching dry soil the only rhythm to break the silence. He had no clear destination, no ranch waiting for him, no home beyond the one he had just been thrown from. Every step was a reminder that he carried nothing now but his choices, and the animal that had bound itself to him through suffering. The first day away from the ranch was the hardest. The land that had once been familiar suddenly felt endless and hostile. The sun burned high in the sky, and the weight of his bedroll pressed against his shoulder. Ghost kept close, hobbling on his splinted leg, his breath quick but steady. Ethan stopped often to let him rest, sharing sips of water from his canteen. He never thought he'd grow so attached to a creature, but the sight of Ghost pushing himself to keep up, refusing to be left behind, stirred something deep in his chest. At night, they camped under the stars. The air was sharp with cold, and coyotes howled in the distance. Ethan built a small fire and wrapped his coat around the dog to keep him warm, choosing the chill for himself. Ghost pressed close anyway, his body heat a comfort against the loneliness that gnawed at Ethan's. "Thoughts, funny, ain't it?" Ethan murmured to the dark sky. "A man thrown out of his own people's company finds a friend in a half-dead dog." He smiled wryly, though there was no one to see it. "Guess we're both strays now." The second day stretched longer. Hunger clawed at him. His food had dwindled to scraps. He foraged for what little he could find, wild berries, roots, and once a rabbit snared with a bit of wire he carried. Ghost gnawed the bones clean while Ethan chewed slowly, savoring every bite, like it was a feast. It was then, trudging across the dust and silence, that Ethan began to sense something, a feeling that he was not alone. He'd catch movement out of the corner of his eye. Shadows on a ridge, grass bending against the wind as though something more than air stirred it. Once, as he filled his canteen at a creek, Ghost's ears pricked, his gaze fixed on the hills. Ethan followed the dog's stare, but saw nothing but rocks and sky. Still, the feeling lingered. Watched. Measured. By the third night, Ethan could no longer shake the thought. As he sat by the fire, he leaned toward Ghost, scratching the dog gently behind the ears. "You feel it too, don't you? Eyes out there. Quiet ones." Ghost lifted his head, gave a low growl, then settled again. Ethan chuckled softly. "Yeah, I reckon if they meant to hurt us, they'd have done it already." And he was right. In the shadows beyond his camp, unseen to him, Apache scouts kept watch. They had followed Ethan since the day Briggs cast him out, studying his every action. Each night, they saw how he tended the dog with care, breaking his bread in half to share it. They saw him sleep cold so the animal could rest warm. They heard his voice carried on the wind, not speaking of hate or anger, but of simple truths: loneliness, loss, and a stubborn heart that refused to let go of mercy. For the Apache, such things mattered. They measured men not just by their strength in battle, but by the way they honored life, by the choices they made when no one else was watching. Ethan, though he did not know it, was proving himself worthy of respect, but to Ethan, the days felt heavy with uncertainty. His long walk home was no walk toward anything at all. It was wandering, drifting. Home was a word that now felt empty. He thought of his childhood in Missouri, a cabin long since abandoned. He thought of the ranch he had just lost, of the bunkhouse laughter he would never share again. Each memory was like a door closed tight. One evening, exhausted, he sat by the fire and stared at Ghost. "Where do we go, boy?" "Got no job, no roof, just the sky and the dirt beneath our feet." He rubbed his face, feeling the grit of dust and sweat. "Guess that makes us free. But free don't fill a man's belly, does it?" Ghost gave a faint wag of his tail, as if reminding Ethan that freedom had its own worth. As dawn broke the next morning, Ethan rose and slung his pack across his back, ready to walk again. The horizon stretched endless, and his steps were slow but steady. He thought the world had forgotten him, cast him out to wander. What he didn't know was that his every step was being weighed in silence, his name already whispered around Apache fires. His long walk wasn't leading him to an end. It was leading him to a beginning, though it would take the thunder of 300 hooves at dawn to show him. The ranch was never truly quiet. Even at night, the lowing of cattle, the creak of timbers, and the restless shift of horses filled the air. But in the days after Ethan's dismissal, a different kind of restlessness settled over the place, one that couldn't be measured by noise. It was in the way the men looked over their shoulders more often, how they lingered near their rifles, how the air felt heavy even beneath the broad desert sky. Briggs, the foreman, carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he'd done the right thing. He spat tobacco in the dirt, puffed up with pride as he told and retold the tale of the fool boy who near brought ruin to the ranch. Every time the story passed his lips, Ethan grew more reckless, more naive, until by the end of the week, Briggs had nearly convinced the men that firing him was an act of heroism. But pride is thin armor against fear. At supper one evening, the ranch hands gathered in the long mess shed. Tin plates clattered, spoons scraped, but conversation was hushed. One man, Jackson, finally spoke what many were thinking. "Briggs," he said, setting down his fork, "don't sit right with me, the way you threw the boy out." Briggs scowled. "You want us all scalped in our beds, Jackson? He was keeping an Apache beast. That's as good as sending word to the warriors that we're soft." Jackson leaned forward, his weathered face lit by the lantern glow. "Maybe. Or maybe it sends word that one of us showed decency. That matters, don't it? You ever think the Apache might respect such a thing?" A murmur ran through the room. Briggs slammed his hand against the table, rattling cups. "Respect? You think the Apache care about respect? They'll take it as weakness, same as wolves smelling blood. And if they come, it won't be that boy's back they cut open. It'll be yours, and every man, woman, and child within 20 miles. Silence fell heavy. Some shifted uneasily, but no one dared press further. Briggs had made up his mind, and to challenge him was to invite his wrath. That night, though, the unease grew. A rider came in from the east pasture reporting strange. Tracks in the brush, hooves, too many to be a stray herd. Another swore he'd seen smoke rising in the distance, where no settler cabins stood. And though Briggs dismissed it as nerves, the men exchanged uneasy looks when they thought he wasn't watching. By dawn, Briggs ordered every hand to oil their rifles, sharpen their knives, and double the watch. "We're not going to be caught. Nappin'!" he barked. "Apache love to strike at dawn. We'll be ready." The ranch became a fortress in motion. Fences were reinforced, ammunition counted, horses saddled and kept close. Men who once whistled as they worked now moved in. Silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. Even the cattle seemed to sense the shift, bunching together in restless herds, lowing nervously at night. Briggs strutted through it all, barking orders, cursing hesitation, his chest swelling as though he alone carried the burden of their safety. But beneath that tough hide, even he couldn't shake the shadows that seemed to stalk the edges of the land. On the third night, a lone rider arrived from a neighboring spread. Dust covered his face, and his horse foamed at the mouth. He burst into the ranch yard, shouting, "They're restless! Apache seen ride in the ridges near the river. Whole groups of 'em. Not just scouts, bands!" The news struck like a hammer blow. The men stopped what they were doing, fear flashing in their eyes. Some cursed under their breath, others crossed themselves. Briggs gritted his teeth, waving the rider off. "Rumors," he growled. "They always ride the ridges. Nothing new about that." But that night, Briggs couldn't sleep. He paced the veranda of the ranch house, staring into the dark horizon, his hand never far from the Colt at his hip. He had told himself he was right to cast Ethan out, that mercy had no place in this land. But the unease gnawed at him. He thought of the dog, the way its beaded collar marked it as something sacred. He thought of Ethan's words, "Mercy ain't treason. It's just decency." He spat into the dirt and tried to drive the thought away. Inside the bunkhouse, the men lay awake, whispering of what might come. Some cursed Ethan for bringing this trouble on them. Others, quietly, wondered if perhaps his act of kindness had been the only thing that might have kept the Apache's wrath at bay. The ranch was armed, watchful, ready for war. But readiness was not the same as safety. The horizon loomed dark, and every man on Briggs's ranch felt the weight of something coming, something bigger than rifles or fences could hold back. They were preparing for a fight they didn't yet understand. And when dawn finally came, it would not be their weapons that decided their fate, but the memory of one man and a wounded dog. Far from the ranch, beyond the ridges where the desert gave way to high plateaus, the Apache gathered around a great fire. The night was clear, stars burning bright above them like scattered embers across the sky. The people sat in a wide circle, warriors, elders, women with children, all listening as the scouts returned with their reports. Among them was Taza, the lean-eyed scout who had watched Ethan these past nights. The firelight flickered across his face as he spoke. "I have followed the white man who saved the dog. He does not belong to the ranch anymore. They cast him out for what he did. Yet still he carries the animal, feeds it, and tends its wounds. I saw him give it food when he had none for himself. I saw him sleep cold so it would be warm. He is not like the others." Murmurs spread through the circle. Some shook their heads, others nodded. For the Apache, such details mattered. A man revealed his spirit not in words but in his actions when no one else was watching. The dog lay nearby now, having been brought into camp once its leg had healed enough to travel. Ghost lifted his head, ears pricked at the sound of Ethan's name on Taza's lips. The animal's presence alone spoke louder than any scout's testimony. It was alive, strong again, and it carried the memory of who had saved it. An elder, named Nantan, his hair white as bone, leaned forward. His voice was slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of many winters. Among our people, the dog is not just a beast. It walks with the warrior. It guards the camp. It is a spirit of loyalty. To save one is to honor more than flesh. It is to honor memory. A younger warrior, fierce and impatient, shook his head. So one white man showed kindness. What of the rest? His ranch still drives cattle over our land, still builds fences where our fathers hunted. The dog lives, but our people suffer. His words struck deep, and many nodded. The anger against the settlers ran long and bitter, but Nantan's voice rose again, calm but unyielding. Yes, the ranchers take, and they do not ask. Yes, they bring rifles and fences. But listen well, this man was punished by his own for sparing what was sacred. They cast him out for his mercy. That shows the ranch's heart is cruel, yet it also shows the man's heart is true. The chief of the band, Cochise's kinsman Chenzin, stood tall at the fire's edge, his long hair tied with red cloth. His voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. The white foreman mocked our ways. He called what is sacred nothing. He shamed the man who honored us. For this, his ranch must learn respect, not through words, but through fear. The fire popped loudly as though agreeing. All eyes turned toward him. We will ride, Chenzin declared. Not to kill without cause, but to show our strength. At dawn, 300 warriors will surround the ranch. They will see with their own eyes that one act of cruelty can summon the fury of a nation. They will know it was Ethan's mercy that spared them. Without him, they would be ashes. Gasps and nods circled the fire. The decision was made. Taza spoke once more, softer now. I watched Ethan. He does not know his choice carries such weight. To him it was only a dog. But the spirits see further. They chose him to remind us that honor still lives, even among our enemies. Ghost padded forward, stopping beside the firelight. His beaded collar gleamed as his dark eyes searched the faces of the gathered warriors. Some smiled at the sight. Others bowed their heads in respect. For the Apache, it was a sign, proof that the spirits blessed this course of action. The council broke with the sound of voices rising into the night, warriors preparing their ponies, sharpening lances, stringing bows. Mothers gathered their children, singing low songs to calm them. The smell of smoke and cedar filled the air as the fire burned brighter, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the anticipation of what was to come. When the council ended, Chenzin walked alone to the edge of the ridge. From there, he could see the plains stretch into darkness, the faint glow of settler fires far in the distance. His eyes hardened. By dawn, he whispered to the wind, they will remember the dog, and they will remember that the Apache ride not for blood, alone, but for respect. Behind him, 300 warriors readied themselves, their voices and drums echoing through the night like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. And in the distance, unaware of the tide rising against him, Ethan lay beneath the stars with Ghost at his side, dreaming of nothing more than survival. The night before dawn was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against a man's chest and made his breathing slow, as if the world itself were holding still. Out on the open plain, Ethan sat by a meager fire, the crackle of dry mesquite, the only sound besides the restless shuffle of Ghost at his side. The dog was stronger now, limping less, his sharp eyes always scanning the horizon as if sensing more than Ethan could. Ethan reached out, scratching behind Ghost's ears. "You're restless tonight," he said softly. "Can't blame you. Feels like the whole land's waiting on something." He wasn't wrong. Though Ethan couldn't see them, hundreds of Apache warriors sat gathered on ridges miles away, their ponies silent, their weapons gleaming faintly in the starlight. They waited without speaking, a wall of patience and fire held back only by the turning of the earth. Ethan's thoughts drifted like smoke. He remembered his last night in the bunkhouse, how Briggs had dragged him out, how the men had looked at him with a mix of pity and suspicion. He had been cast out not for laziness, not for theft, but for kindness. The irony of it gnawed at him still. "Mercy," he whispered into the flames. "That's what it was, and it cost me everything." Ghost whined, resting his muzzle on Ethan's boot. The gesture made him smile despite the weight in his chest. "Maybe not everything," Ethan admitted. "I got you, don't I?" The fire popped, sending sparks upward into the black sky. Ethan leaned back, staring at the stars. Out here, away from ranch noise and men's judgments, the heavens seemed bigger, closer. He thought of his mother back in Missouri, a woman who taught him to feed stray cats even when food was scarce. "Every creature has its place," she had said. "Every life is worth something." That memory warmed him more than the fire, but the warmth didn't last. As the wind shifted, Ethan felt a strange chill ripple over him. The hair on his arms rose, and Ghost lifted his head sharply, growling low in his throat. Ethan scanned the darkness, heart thudding, but saw nothing but empty grasslands and the dim outline of distant hills. Still, he knew. They were out there, watching. He sighed and laid back, pulling his hat low over his eyes. "If they mean to come, let 'em," he muttered. "Ain't got much left to take." Sleep came in uneasy fragments, filled with dreams of hoofbeats and fire. In one dream, Ethan stood alone as riders surrounded him, their faces hidden by shadows. Ghost barked at his side, but his voice was swallowed by thunder. While Ethan slept restlessly on the plains, the ranch was wide awake. Briggs paced the yard with a lantern in hand, barking orders to any hand who lingered too long in the bunkhouse. Rifles were stacked by the doorways, horses tied close with saddles ready. The men whispered among themselves, their voices brittle with fear. "They say the Apache don't strike unless they mean to kill every soul," one muttered. "3 nights now, I swear I've heard drumming on the wind," said another. "Maybe it's just coyotes." "Coyotes don't make the earth shake." Briggs silenced them with curses, but his own hands trembled as he held the lantern. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but Ethan's dismissal weighed on him. The boy had been loyal, hard-working, maybe too soft, but not faithless. Briggs spat into the dirt and told himself it didn't matter. He'd done what was necessary. Still, in the back of his mind, a voice whispered, "What if you were wrong?" The ranch hands lay sleepless in their bunks, staring at the dark rafters. Every sound, the creak of wood, the whinny of a horse, the snap of a branch, sounded like the start of an attack. Some prayed silently, lips moving in the dark. Others simply clenched their fists, resigned to whatever dawn would bring. The whole frontier seemed to hold its breath that night. Out on the ridges, the Apache warriors sat silent astride their ponies, lined in long shadows against the stars. 300 riders, each one still as stone, waiting for the signal. The only sound was the soft snort of horses, the faint rustle of feathers tied to spears, the low chant of an elder whispering prayers to the spirits. Chenzin, their leader, lifted his eyes to the horizon where the first faint hint of gray touched the east. He raised his hand slowly, the gesture carrying down the line of warriors like a wave. Hearts beat faster, muscles tightened, horses shifted. The storm was ready, and so the night passed, long and tense, every man, settler, outcast, and warrior alike, feeling the same heavy truth. The world would change at dawn. The first streaks of light broke the horizon, painting the plains in pale gray. A wind stirred, cold and sharp, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and dust. Ethan rose from where he had slept fitfully, rubbing the grit from his eyes. Ghost sat alert beside him, ears pricked, tail stiff, a low growl rumbling from his throat. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" And then he heard it. At first, just a tremor, so soft it could have been mistaken for the shifting of earth. But it grew, a steady rhythmic pounding that rolled across the land, the sound of hooves. Not a dozen, not 50, hundreds. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He stood, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the horizon. And there they came, over the ridge. To the east, the warriors appeared like shadows made flesh. 300 strong, they rode in perfect silence, a tide of painted faces, eagle feathers, and flashing steel. The morning sun caught on spear tips and rifle barrels, turning them into streaks of fire. The earth shook beneath their charge. The rhythm of hooves a drumbeat of vengeance. Ethan felt his knees weaken at the sight. It was not chaos. It was discipline, power, unity. He had seen cavalry before, but nothing like this. These riders were the land itself moving as one, storm and stone and fire bound together. Ghost barked sharply, his hackles raised. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's back, steadying him. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "They ain't after us." He hoped he was right. Far ahead, the ranch erupted into panic. The ranch hands poured from the bunkhouse, rifles clutched tight, faces drained of all color. Briggs bellowed orders, his voice raw with fear. "To the fences! Hold steady!" But his commands were lost under the thunder of approaching hooves. The ranch, a place built on cattle, sweat, and barbed wire, suddenly felt fragile, a lone island in a sea of fury. The men scrambled to mount defenses, but their hands shook as they loaded rifles. The sight of so many riders advancing in silence was too much. It was like watching the hand of judgment descend. Ethan could see them clearly now. At the head rode Chenzin, tall and commanding, his long black hair flowing behind him, his chest painted with red streaks of war. His eyes burned with a light that could not be mistaken for cruelty. It was purpose. Beside him rode elders, scouts, and young warriors alike, their faces marked with ash and color, their mouths set in grim silence. As the column approached the ranch, they slowed, the thunder of hooves dwindling into a heavy, rolling echo. The dust they raised hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Then, in perfect unison, they spread out, encircling the ranch. 300 riders formed a living wall around the property, their eyes fixed inward, their presence suffocating. The ranch hands froze. Not a single rifle fired. Fear had rooted them to the spot. Briggs stumbled forward, his lantern from the night before still in hand, though the sun was rising. His bluster was gone, replaced by wide-eyed terror. "Hold your fire!" he shouted. To his men, though none had dared shoot. His voice cracked. "Nobody move!" The silence that followed was unbearable. The only sound was the restless snort of horses and the faint creak of saddle leather. From where Ethan stood on the rise, he watched it all unfold. His chest was tight, his throat dry. Part of him wanted to turn away, to walk back into the wilderness, and leave the ranch to its fate. But another part held him in place, unable to look away from the storm he had unknowingly set into motion. Chenzin raised his hand, and every warrior sat straighter, still as stone. His voice carried clear across, the yard strong and sharp. "Where is the one who saved what was sacred?" The words cut through the silence like a blade. The ranch hands shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. Briggs paled, sweat beading on his brow. He swallowed hard, his lips trembling as he found his voice. He's gone," Briggs stammered. "We cast him out. Yesterday. He ain't here." A murmur rippled through the Apache ranks, not of anger, but disbelief. They had ridden to demand honor for the man who showed mercy, and instead they found that he had been punished for it. Chenzin's face hardened. He looked at the trembling foreman, then at the line of ranch hands, and then back at the sprawling house behind them. The silence stretched, heavy as iron. The ranchers gripped their rifles tighter, though their hands shook so badly the barrels rattled. They expected an attack, slaughter, fire, but none came. Instead, Chenzin leaned forward in his saddle and spoke again, his voice like rolling thunder. "You cast him out for mercy. Then know this. Your lives stand not on your strength, but on his name." The words struck like a hammer blow. The ranch was spared, for now. But every man knew the weight of the warning. Ethan, watching from the hilltop, felt his breath release in a shudder. His legs trembled as the truth settled in. He was no longer just a ranch hand. He was the measure by which two worlds had been weighed. The sun climbed higher, painting the scene in harsh gold. 300 riders stood ready, their silence louder than any gunshot. And all of them had come, not for war, but for him. The ranch yard was a prison of silence. 300 Apache warriors sat astride their horses, encircling the property like a noose, their faces painted in stark patterns of black, red, and white. The air was tight, charged, heavy with the weight of what might come next. Briggs stood at the center, his chest heaving, the bravado that usually carried him gone like mist at dawn. His men clutched their rifles, but none dared lift a weapon. They were outnumbered, outflanked, and utterly unprepared. From the circle of riders, Chenzin stepped his horse forward, the animal snorting and pawing at the dirt. His gaze was fixed, on the ranch house, then on the men trembling before him. His words, spoken in a voice like stone grinding against stone, shattered the silence. "Where is the man who showed honor?" Briggs hesitated, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. He knew the question was about Ethan, the ranch hand he had humiliated and cast out the day before. His throat bobbed as he forced words past his lips. He ain't here. We let him go. Yesterday." Murmurs rippled through the Apache ranks. They glanced at one another, their expressions a mix of surprise and disgust. To their people, Ethan's act, saving the sacred dog, was a gesture of respect that demanded acknowledgement. For the ranch to have answered it with dismissal was unthinkable. Chenzin's eyes burned with fury. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice rising sharp as a blade. "You punished him for mercy?" Briggs swallowed, sweat dripping down his temples. "We don't take kindly to men helping enemies," he said, though the strength in his voice faltered halfway through. "We protect our own." A roar of disapproval swept through the Apache warriors. They stamped their horses, lifted their spears, and shouted words that rang like thunder across the valley. The sound sent chills down the spines of every ranch hand. Chenzin lifted his hand, and the noise died instantly. His gaze stayed locked on Briggs. "You think yourself strong? You think yourself just?" He pointed toward the foreman, his arm, steady, his voice cutting. "You live because of him, not because of your guns, not because of your walls, because of the man you cast aside." The words hit like a rifle shot. Briggs staggered, his face pale as milk. He opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came. Around him, the ranch hands shifted uneasily. For the first time, some of them looked ashamed. One of the older ranch hands, Thomas, a grizzled man with gray in his beard, stepped forward. He lowered his rifle, dropping it into the dust with a clatter. "They're right," he said hoarsely. "Ethan's a better man than any of us. We all saw it. You fired him for doing what was decent." The words silenced even Briggs. He looked around, searching for support, but saw only doubt in the faces of the men who had once followed his every order. Chenzin's horse pawed the ground, restless. The Apache leader's gaze swept across the yard, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke again, his tone solemn, final. "You are spared this day, not for who you are, but for what he is. Remember this, the land does not forget, and neither do we." The warriors let out a low, unified cry, not of war, but of warning. They shifted their formation, their horses turning as one, the circle opening like the parting of storm clouds. Briggs collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling as he pressed them into the dirt. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, relief mixing with terror. He knew in his heart that if Ethan had not shown mercy to that dog, the ranch would now be ash and blood. From the hill overlooking the scene, Ethan watched with wide eyes. His chest tightened as he saw the truth revealed. His single act of kindness had shifted the fate of everyone on that ranch, though those very men had cast him out in shame. Ghost pressed against his leg, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Ethan stroked the dog's head absent-mindedly, his thoughts caught between sorrow and vindication. Down below, the Apache warriors began to retreat, their silent withdrawal as commanding as their arrival. Dust rose in clouds behind them, the thunder of hooves fading into the horizon. Yet the impression they left lingered like a scar carved deep into the earth. In the ranch yard, the men stood in stunned silence, the echo of Chenzin's words burning in their minds. No one spoke. No one moved. The air was thick with shame, fear, and something deeper, respect for the man they had once scorned. And on the hilltop, Ethan turned his back to the ranch and walked into the wilderness, Ghost trotting, loyally at his side. He knew the rancher's survival was not his burden to carry anymore. His path now belonged to something larger, something wilder, etched not in fences and barbed wire, but in honor and mercy, the only weapons that truly endured. The ranch yard remained hushed long after the Apache riders disappeared into the horizon. Dust swirled slowly back to the ground, settling on the wooden rails, the barn roofs, and the pale faces of the men who had just brushed against death. The ranch hands stood as if waking from a dream, rifles slack in their grip, their eyes fixed on the empty space where 300 warriors had been. Briggs, the once proud foreman, still knelt in the dirt. His hat lay crushed beneath his hand, his chest heaving, shame carved deep lines into his face. No boast could cover the truth anymore. His arrogance had brought the ranch to its knees, and only the man he had cast out had spared them all. On the distant ridge, Ethan remained still, Ghost pressed against his leg. He watched the men below, shuffle aimlessly, their heads hanging low. A strange mix of emotions churned in his chest, vindication, sorrow, and something close to peace. He hadn't sought revenge nor triumph, only the chance to do what felt right. Yet here he stood, witness to how one small act of mercy had echoed like thunder across the frontier. The sun climbed higher, painting the land in gold. The silence, stretched, broken only by the faint rattle of tack from horses shifting nervously in the corral. Then, as if carried by the wind itself, a sound reached the ranch yard. Hoofbeats, steady and sure, every man stiffened, hands twitching toward their rifles again. But this time, only a single rider emerged from the far edge of the prairie. Chenzin, alone. He rode with calm dignity, his spear resting across his lap, the morning light gleaming off his hair and paint. No war cry followed him now, no army at his back. Only the quiet authority of a man whose presence commanded respect. The ranchers stepped aside instinctively, giving him a clear path to the center of the yard. Briggs scrambled to his feet, wiping dirt from his knees, trying to summon what little pride he had left. But Chenzin barely spared him a glance. His eyes were fixed on the ridge, on Ethan. "Come down!" Chenzin called, his voice carrying effortlessly across the open space. Ethan hesitated. Ghost whined, sensing the weight of the moment. With a slow breath, Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head, then began his descent down the slope. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was reminding him of the burden he carried. When he reached the yard, all eyes turned to him. The same men who had mocked him only yesterday now watched in silence, some with guilt in their eyes, others with awe. Briggs opened his mouth to speak, but Chenzen raised a hand, silencing him. The Apache leader dismounted, standing tall before Ethan. For a long moment he said nothing, only studying the young man who had defied both his employer and the prejudices of his time. Then, with a gesture that sent ripples of shock through the ranch yard, Chenzen extended his hand. "You carry honor," he said simply. Ethan looked at the offered hand, his throat tight. Slowly he clasped it. Their grip was firm, the kind that bound more than flesh. It bound understanding, respect, and something deeper. Trust. Chenzen nodded once, then released him. "The dog you saved belonged to a warrior who fell defending his people. To us, it was no mere animal, but a spirit-tied companion. You gave respect to what we hold sacred. For that, your name is known among us." Ethan swallowed hard, emotion rising like a tide. "I only did what felt right," he said, softly. Chenzen's gaze lingered on him a moment longer, then he mounted his horse. "The land remembers mercy as much as it remembers blood," he said, his voice carrying like prophecy. "Choose your path well, Ethan. You are no longer just ranch hand or outcast. You are bridge." With that, he turned his horse and rode back across the open plain, his figure shrinking until it vanished into the horizon. The ranch yard was still again, but something fundamental had shifted. The men looked at Ethan differently now, not as a fool or a traitor, but as a man who had stood taller than any of them when it mattered most. Briggs shuffled forward, his face ashen. He opened his mouth, struggling to find words. Ethan raised a hand, stopping him. "Save it," he said quietly. "You made your choice yesterday, and I've made mine today." He turned his back on them, Ghost trotting at his side, tail wagging as though sensing freedom. Ethan didn't look back as he walked beyond the ranch gates, his boots crunching on the dusty ground. The prairie stretched before him, endless and untamed. Somewhere out there lay a life no longer bound by another man's orders, but by his own conscience. The dog at his side was more than a companion. It was a symbol of the path he had chosen. Compassion over cruelty, honor over fear. Behind him, the ranch would continue, but it would never forget the morning 300 warriors rode upon it, or the man who had spared it through nothing more than a single act of mercy.